The year is 745. The city is Chang'an, the jeweled capital of the Tang dynasty, home to 1 million souls and the most powerful empire on earth. But you are not walking the merchant streets or sitting in the imperial court. You are in the Forbidden City, in a palace that few ever leave. More precisely, you are in the Cold Palace. Your name is Xuân. You were 17 when the emperor first noticed you 5 years ago. Your parents were overjoyed. Your future seemed to shimmer with silk and jade. Now you are 22, and you have the face of someone much older. Your hair, once thick and arranged with care, is matted. Your hands are raw from scrubbing stone floors. The scent that surrounds you is not perfume, but lye water and your own sweat. Today, you are on your knees in a small courtyard with 15 other women. The winter wind cuts across your neck. You are grinding millet with a stone mortar, work that is meant for servants, not concubines. But you are not a concubine anymore. That title belongs to the young girls who came after you, the ones the emperor now summons to his chambers at night. You are what happens after favor dies. A shadow falls across your grinding stone. Your body tenses. It is the palace supervisor, the woman they call the Crow, because of how she moves through the halls, watching everything. She does not speak. She never does. She simply stands, observing your hands, your posture, checking for any sign of slowness or defiance. After a long moment, she moves on. You continue grinding, but your jaw clenches so hard it aches. The Crow could have ordered you beaten simply for the way you looked at her. In the Cold Palace, that is enough. Xuân, like so many others, is living in a system that no one outside these walls truly understands. A system where the highest honor contains within it the seeds of absolute destruction, where being chosen by an emperor can be the worst thing that ever happens to you, and where to fall from favor means entering a living death from which there is almost no escape. This moment, grinding millet on a frozen morning, afraid to breathe too loudly, is not the start of a redemption story. It is the continuation of a much larger machine of power, one that has crushed thousands of women before her and will crush thousands after. Everything you are about to hear is grounded in documented history. The Cold Palace was real. The women trapped within it were real. Their suffering is preserved not in myths or legends, but in official court records, in the diaries of consorts who survived, in palace household accounts that list food rations, in the medical reports of physicians who treated women driven to madness, and in the testimonies of servants who witnessed these lives from close proximity. We have the records of the Han dynasty and the complete records of the Tang, official histories written by imperial scribes who documented the fates of fallen concubines and the punishments inflicted upon them. We have the palace memoirs written by educated consorts like Cao Ji and Pan Jie, women who left behind accounts of their terror and loss. We have medical texts from physicians working in the imperial harem that describe symptoms of what we would now recognize as severe depression, malnutrition, and trauma. We have archaeological evidence from tomb inscriptions listing the names of concubines who died in servitude and were buried in mass graves. But most significantly, we have the laws themselves, the actual legal codes that govern the treatment of fallen imperial women. These were not whispered cruelties or the informal practices of individual tyrants. They were written policy, debated in court, and enforced with bureaucratic precision. When we read these texts today, we are reading the words of a system that did not hide what it was doing. It openly codified the destruction of women who had once worn the emperor's favor. To understand what happened to women like Xuân, you must first understand the architecture of the imperial harem itself. The harem was not simply a pleasure palace, though it often appears that way in later fiction. It was a carefully orchestrated political apparatus, perhaps one of the most sophisticated instruments of authority ever devised by a court. The harem was organized in strict hierarchies. At the top was the empress, the official wife, chosen for political alliance or dynastic stability. Below her were the consorts, the highest rank of concubine, often numbering 3 to 5. Below them were the secondary consorts, then the concubines proper, then the attendants, then the servants. A woman could rise through these ranks, but the rise was precarious. She rose only as long as she bore the emperor a son, as long as she remained young and beautiful, as long as she did not anger him, and as long as she did not become inconvenient to other members of the imperial family. The apparatus functioned on multiple levels. First, it was a form of population control and social reward. Commanding tens of thousands of young women to the palace removed them from the marriage market, preventing lower-ranking nobles from forming powerful family alliances. It was also a reward mechanism. Ambitious families would offer their daughters to the palace in hopes of gaining influence through a son born to the emperor. Some historians estimate that a healthy emperor could father dozens of children with concubines, creating a vast web of half-siblings who would be placed in positions of prominence throughout the empire. In this way, the harem was not separate from governance. It was governance. But there was a darker dimension as well, the demonstration of absolute dominance. The harem allowed the emperor to display his supremacy over the bodies of women. In Confucian philosophy, women were understood as subordinate to men in every sphere, first to their fathers, then to their husbands, then to their sons. The imperial harem was the ultimate expression of this hierarchy. It demonstrated that the emperor could take any woman, elevate her, and discard her, all without consequence. It showed that no woman, no matter her family background, was safe from his will. And then there was the matter of succession. As an emperor aged or became less fertile, the women who could no longer bear his children became useless to the system. Moreover, if an emperor died, his women became a problem. Could a new emperor inherit the harem of his father? The answer was complicated, and different dynasties handled it differently. But in general, older concubines and those who had lost favor during the previous reign became expendable. Some were forced to commit suicide following the emperor's death. Others were cast into the cold palace, where they would live out their remaining years in isolation. This is the system Xuân entered when she was chosen. It was not a happy accident or a matter of romantic selection. It was a calculated political institution backed by law and philosophy. And once a woman was incited, her fate, whether glorious or terrible, was largely beyond her control. Xuân's day begins before dawn. She wakes to the sound of a bell, a harsh, flat sound that echoes through the cold palace courtyard. Around her, in the small, unheated room she shares with 4 other women, bodies shift under thin blankets. One woman, May, is already coughing. She has been coughing since autumn. No one speaks. Silence is the first rule of the cold palace. By the time the sun rises, Xuân has already been assigned her labor. Today, as on most days, it is the millet grinding. But on other days it might be scrubbing the stone floors on her hands and knees, carrying water from the well. Work designed not because the palace needs the labor, but because the work is designed to break the spirit. The supervisors time them. They check the results. Any work deemed insufficient results in punishment, a reduction of the meager food ration, confinement to the room, or, in more severe cases, the cane across the back. The food she receives is calculated to maintain life but not comfort. Rice mixed with chaff, thin vegetable broth, sometimes with pork fat if it is a holiday, though no one marks holidays in the cold palace. In her years before falling from favor, Xuân ate delicacies. Fresh fruit brought from southern provinces, expensive fish, cakes made with honey and pine nuts. She ate off porcelain plates painted with birds. Now she eats from a cracked ceramic bowl that the servants use for animals. Her clothing has transformed as well. Once she wore silks dyed in colors that took weeks to create. Deep crimsons, subtle blues, greens that held the shimmer of water. Now she wears undyed linen, rough against her skin, the same outfit worn by all fallen women so that they are immediately identifiable if they somehow manage to escape. There is no variation, no individuality, no beauty. The purpose is not to clothe, but to mark, to announce to anyone who sees them that these women are outside the human community, are not worth the small dignity of fine fabric. The supervisors embody this surveillance. The crow moves through the courtyard multiple times each day, making rounds, watching, never speaking, simply observing your hands, your posture, checking for any sign of slowness or defiance. But she is not the cruelest. There is another. The women call her the bone keeper, who takes pleasure in finding reasons for punishment. She might claim that Xuân's bow was not deep enough when greeting her, or that her eyes were directed too boldly upward. These small violations of an endless code of rules result in confinement, locked in a small room for a day without food, left sitting in darkness. But Xuân is not entirely alone in this darkness. Next to her in the grinding stone sits Lian, a woman 3 years younger, who was brought to the palace when she was 16 and summoned only twice before being discarded. Lian still has the ability to smile, though it is rare now. One afternoon, as they grind, Lian hums, so quietly that even Xuân can barely hear it. It is a lullaby from her village, something her mother once sang. The crow does not hear it, but if she had, the punishment would have been severe. Singing is forbidden. Anything that might bring comfort or memory is forbidden. In contrast stands Wu Sheng, an older woman who has been in the cold palace for 12 years. She remembers being summoned to the emperor's chambers 3 times, each time as the favor of a younger, more beautiful woman grew. She has made a kind of peace with her situation that is more terrifying than any rebellion. She has stopped speaking entirely. She performs her labor without emotion. She eats mechanically. Sometimes Xuân wonders if Wu Sheng is still alive, or if she died long ago and simply forgot to stop moving. In the evenings, when darkness falls and the supervisors retreat to warmer quarters, the women have a few hours of minimal surveillance. Xuân sometimes sits against the courtyard wall and remembers her mother's face, the feel of her father's hand, the taste of specific foods, the sound of music played on instruments she will never touch again. This is dangerous, these memories. They make the present unbearable. But they are also the only thing that proves she was ever anyone other than what she is now. The ultimate horror of the cold palace was not random cruelty, but ritualized dehumanization. The worst abuses followed a strict pattern, designed to systematically destroy a woman's sense of self and her connection to her former identity. One such ritual was the naming ceremony, performed when a woman first arrived after losing favor. The supervisors would gather the fallen woman in a small chamber. The emperor would be told her name, but she would be given a new designation, often just a number or an animal name. Xuân was officially called Attendant Number 17, though behind her back the guards called her the Forgotten One. This naming served a dual purpose. It made her legally invisible while simultaneously marking her as permanently other. If she was injured or fell ill, there was no need to report it through proper channels. She was no one. Another ritual was the annual inspection. conducted by the chief eunuch himself. Once each year, all fallen women would be lined up in a single line, stripped to simple garments, and examined as though they were livestock. Their teeth were checked, their skin was inspected for disease, they were weighed. This ritual had no official purpose. The women were not being prepared for anything. The inspection existed purely to reinforce their powerlessness, to remind them that their bodies were not their own and could be subjected to examination and judgment at any time. But perhaps the most psychologically devastating aspect was the complete erasure of the possibility of bearing children. Women who fell from favor were sometimes given herbal mixtures that rendered them infertile, a measure taken to ensure they could never claim that a child was the emperor's offspring and use that claim as leverage. For a woman in ancient China, fertility was the primary source of value and potential power. To have that possibility stolen was to be made into something less than a woman in the eyes of society. It was to be rendered utterly powerless. The isolation was itself a form of abuse. The cold palace existed within the larger palace complex, but was completely separated. Fallen women could not leave. They could not receive visitors. Their families did not know if they were alive or dead. Letters were intercepted. For years, Xuan's parents had no idea that she was alive, rotting in a courtyard only miles from their home. The psychological impact of this isolation, the knowledge that the outside world had moved on without you, that you were forgotten, was perhaps more destructive than physical punishment. When a woman showed signs of resistance, refusal to obey, speaking out of turn, or attempting to contact the outside world, the punishments escalated. One woman named Qing, who was caught trying to write a letter to her family, had her hands beaten with a cane until 2 fingers were permanently damaged. She could no longer work as efficiently, which meant her food rations were reduced further. The punishment for resistance was not a single violent act, but a cascade of consequences designed to make resistance impossible. The system learned from her violation and adjusted to prevent others from attempting the same. There were also deaths. The official records are sparse on this. One of the ways power hides itself is through bureaucratic silence. But the archaeological evidence tells a different story. In mass burial grounds near the Imperial Palace, archaeologists have found the remains of women who died in the cold palace, often from malnutrition, untreated illness, or deliberate neglect. Some show signs of violence. The records list them as having died of natural causes, a phrase that conceals whatever actually occurred. And when a woman died, she was replaced by another girl, chosen at 17 or 18, fed the same story about her glorious future, and brought into the system. By the late Tang dynasty, the cold palace had become such an accepted institution that it was encoded into formal law. The legal code of Emperor Xuanzong explicitly outlined the penalties for a fallen concubine: loss of title, loss of rank, assignment to the cold palace, and forfeiture of all property and family connections. It was not presented as a punishment for wrongdoing, but as the natural consequence of losing favor. The law made it clear that a woman's status was entirely dependent on the emperor's will, and that will was absolute. But this absoluteness eventually attracted criticism, not from the perspective of protecting women, but from Confucian scholars concerned about the image of imperial virtue. By the Song dynasty, some voices at court began to argue that while the cold palace was necessary, its harshest aspects reflected poorly on the emperor's benevolence. Confucius taught that a ruler should embody ren, humaneness, and the visible suffering of women in the cold palace seemed to contradict this principle. In 1040, Emperor Renzong issued a decree proposing limited reforms. The decree suggested that fallen concubines should be treated with somewhat more consideration. Slightly better rations, the right to practice needlework, and the possibility of requesting the emperor's audience to appeal their situation. But these reforms were largely performative. The Cold Palace continued to function much as it had before. The better rations were marginally less inadequate. The possibility of audience was one rarely granted. Most women who petitioned for redress found their punishment increased for their presumption. Xuân, grinding millet in an earlier century, would never know such a decree existed. The promise of reform never reached the women it was meant to help. The deeper issue was that the Cold Palace remained too essential to imperial authority to be genuinely reformed. It was the mechanism by which the emperor exercised dominance over the female population. It demonstrated the ultimate emptiness of a woman's human value, that she could be elevated to the highest ranks and then cast down with no recourse. Removing or seriously reforming the Cold Palace would have undermined the entire foundation of imperial authority. What actually happened was that the system became less visible rather than less brutal. By the Ming Dynasty, the Cold Palace existed but was sometimes relocated or renamed. Its harshest aspects were conducted away from the eyes of visiting officials or court observers. Reforms were announced but not implemented. The system learned to hide itself better, which is perhaps the most effective form of survival for an institution built on cruelty. For women like Xuân, these reforms meant nothing. She lived and died in the Cold Palace, unknown, unremembered, her suffering erased from the official narrative. And even centuries later, when historians began to piece together the truth of what happened within these walls, many accounts still presented the Cold Palace as a necessary evil rather than what it truly was. An instrument of terror designed by a system that valued women only as vessels for power. The story of the Cold Palace is not ancient history disconnected from the present. It is a story about how societies organize themselves around authority. It is about how institutions can make cruelty invisible by embedding it in routine, bureaucracy, and tradition. When we watch Xuân grinding millet in the freezing courtyard, we are not watching randomness or the whim of a single tyrant. We are witnessing policy in action. This is the deliberate construction of helplessness. Throughout human history, hierarchies of authority have discovered that the most effective form of dominance is not the visible brutality of execution or warfare, but the quiet, everyday destruction of a person's sense of self. It is the removal of her name, her body's autonomy, her ability to speak or remember or hope. It is the transformation of a person into an instrument that serves only to demonstrate the supremacy of those above her. The Cold Palace was perhaps uniquely efficient at this, but it was not unique in the fact itself. The ruins of Chang'an still stand today, though much has been rebuilt. Tourists walk through restored sections of the Imperial Palace, viewing carefully arranged gardens and ornate chambers. They rarely think about the courtyard just beyond the visible area, where thousands of women spent decades grinding stone, carrying water, waiting to die. The architecture of erasure is built into these spaces themselves. The Cold Palace was deliberately positioned so that it could not be seen from the main palace, so that the emperor could maintain the comfortable fiction that his discarded women did not exist. This pattern repeats throughout history. We build institutions and embed cruelty within them, then give them respectable names and official purposes, and forget what they truly are. We walk past monuments to injustice without recognizing them. We inherit systems designed by previous generations and assume they must be justified because they have always been there. The question then is this: what are we building today that we will not want to see? What systems are we maintaining because they are convenient, because they serve the interests of those in power, because we have simply accepted them as natural? What women, or men, or any vulnerable population are we pushing into a metaphorical Cold Palace, convincing ourselves that this is how things must be. Xuan's story ends in that courtyard, grinding millet on a winter morning, forgotten by the world outside the walls. But the story of how hierarchies crush the vulnerable does not end. It continues, in different forms, in different places. The cold palace was closed centuries ago, but the apparatus that created it, absolute authority, institutional cruelty disguised as policy, the systematic erasure of humanity, these instruments remain with us. If you believe that these uncomfortable truths deserve to be remembered, that the stories of those who were erased deserve to be told, then subscribe. History is written by the powerful, and often it erases the suffering of those who had no voice. But their stories are still there, in the archaeological record, in the fragments of documents, in the empty spaces where names should be. All we have to do is listen for them. All we have to do is refuse to let them be forgotten.